Scott, 30 years ago, presumed innocent.
True.
The book that some people, I would be one, would say reinvented the legal thriller. Testimony. I learned a lot from Testimony. Correct me if I'm wrong. There was a war in the Balkans. Would that be right?
There
Yes?
was a war in the Balkans.
And the reason I
sadly.
phrased it that way, I got the feeling you wanted to teach us some things besides telling us a great story.
You know, I don't think I wrote Testimony to be like a didactic novel. And I ended up, as it were, as a writer in Bosnia almost by accident. I wanted to write about the International Criminal Court. I wanted to write about the Roma. Having said it's the International Criminal Court, it's got to be a war crime, so that meant it had to be a war crime against the Roma. And once I learned about the International Criminal Court and the antagonism that the American government has had with the court, and I became aware of something that's referred to in Western Europe as the Hague Invasion Act, which is a law that our Congress passed saying that the president has the authority to go rescue any American soldier who's charged by the ICC. That, of course, is a natural setup for a novelist, which says, oh, good, let's have American soldiers under investigation. And the last time American soldiers had been in a combat role in an ICC member country was in Bosnia. So that's how I ended up in Bosnia. But I wasn't, I mean, I always want readers to sort of understand the legal backdrop of the novels that I'm writing. So there is a lot of teaching that goes on in Testimony.
Well, most of us, I don't know if I can speak for everybody here, but most of us couldn't find Bosnia on a map with a tour guide. So to me, at least, and most of us know very little about the International Criminal Court.
Right.
Including the fact that the American government does not recognize its jurisdiction where American soldiers are concerned. So whether you wanted to or not, it seems to me you have taught us a great deal while telling us a great story about William Ten Bloom. Boom. I got you confused with James Joyce there for a second with Bloom. But this is a better read than Ulysses, and Bloom. There will be no quiz after this. Tell us about Mr. Boom.
I'm just thinking about my own reading of Ulysses, which took place while I was working for the United States Post Office as a substitute letter carrier. And once I got the hang of the job, I was able to do it in less than the 8 hours that the letter carriers were paid for. And I made the mistake of walking back into the post office after about 5 hours, and one of the clerks took me down in the basement and explained what was going to happen to my white ass the next time it showed up in the post office in anything less than 8 hours. So the only air-conditioned building in this town was the library, and so I figured I probably ought to read Ulysses, since my professors had told me I was a freshman in college. That was the greatest novel ever written. And I loved reading it, but I really didn't mind getting paid $2.52 an hour to do it.
And I think Faulkner worked in the post office.
He did.
Not the same post office. Boom, Mr. Boom, not Bloom.
Right. So Bill Ten Boom is the former United States attorney, that is to say the top federal prosecutor in my mythical homeland of Kendall County. And his life has gone up for grabs in the wake, actually, of the death of his parents, although he doesn't really put things together this way. And first he leaves, moves out of the house, then ends his marriage, decides that he's going to quit his law firm and has done that, and ultimately, of course, agrees to move overseas to become a prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. And he's as he acknowledges in the early pages of the novel, he's someone who, while ostensibly quite successful, has, as he puts it, never really felt at home with himself.
So his quest, I'm using the word quest because I used to read Professor Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Quest, and Hero of a Thousand Faces. Does he know why he throws everything aside? He's recently been divorced.
Right.
For no good reason other than, well, I shouldn't say no good reason. He was bored with a long-term marriage. That's the way I read it.
Right. Well, he felt that he bored his wife.
Mm-hmm. Well, we all do that. We don't get divorced.
And that, as he was sick of gritting his teeth every day when he came home. So, yeah, I mean, the novel eventually reveals what is working on Bill Ten Boom, but in the fashion of many of us, he's not really aware of what has been bothering him. And he's got, as I think of it, unresolved stuff with his parents, and once they're dead, begins to surface and make him very unhappy with everything in his life.
Which we will not get into in any detail because there are twists and revelations, as there would be in any wonderful novel. I hope this doesn't hurt sales, but there's a lot of sex in this book. I just have to tell it the way it is. There's lust, there's sex, in Ten Boom is in his 50s, early 50s.
Right.
There's a scene with a woman, Esma. Now, I was going to say gypsy. You're using the term Roma. Is gypsy a pejorative term?
That's if you are among Roma, just like, if you're among Native Americans, they will unselfconsciously refer to themselves as Indians. Many Roma refer to themselves as gypsies. It's a misnomer, which is the one reason that the Roma did not come from Egypt, which is where the gypsy name comes from. And that's really the main reason not to use it.
Well, I do remember the stripper Roma Rose Lee, and there was.
It does roll off the tongue.
It does.
That you say it.
The Cher song Roma Tramps and Thieves.
Right.
We could redo. All right. So the New York Times, in a very glowing review, did call Esma a gypsy sex pot.
Yeah.
So
fair enough.
Boom. Ten Boom, but he's called Boom in the book. His friends call him Boom. Goes to The Hague.
Right.
And he's supposed to be investigating what?
Well, the prologue of the book sets up the crime that Boom is investigating, which is it's related by the lone survivor of an alleged massacre of all 400 residents of a Roma refugee camp, which oddly is encircled by American bases of the American peace enforcement troops in Bosnia in 2004. And this witness, Verko Rinchik, tells how these armed men, all wearing ski masks, came in, rounded everybody up, and put them in which really a depression left of a strip mine, but they call it the cave, and detonated hand grenades and caused this opening to collapse and burying all 400 people alive.
And it could be that they were killed by Serbian paramilitary or maybe some other groups or American soldiers in retaliation for a betrayal. So Boom is over there, and in the course of that, he meets this, gypsy sex pot.
It's a gypsy sex pot, right.
And again, I kind of knew what was going to happen. We call this foreshadowing. In the hotel, the lights go out when they're in the corridor. They flicker and go out very nice cinematically. And he smelled her perfume, which was filled with sweetness and allure.
Right.
I knew what was going to happen because I'm a really alert reader.
Yeah,
Didn't happen that night.
many readers have told me that they knew what was going to happen, from about the first paragraph where Esma appears. So.
And when you describe her,
Right.
She is somewhat voluptuous, and Boom is somewhat, I guess the legal term would be horny, and he would it be? And she has an official role in this investigation, so there is some conflict of interest.
Right, of course. It wouldn't be a Turow novel if somebody wasn't breaking the rules,
right.
in order to get laid.
In order to get laid. And I'm not going to let this one go. Lust, middle-aged angst. Peggy Lee could be singing is that all there is?
Right.
In the background. He throws away the ethical rules and hops into bed with this woman. I hope I didn't.
No,
big spoiler
like
alert
I said,
there.
I think this one's written in neon. So.
And not just Boom, but a lot of the men in this book, the general, who bears some relationship fictionally to General Petraeus,
right.
has sacrificed his career, his rank, his family in the pursuit of a woman in his command, violating all of those rules.
Right.
And to me, he was a really wonderful character because he kind of confronts that, and he says he would do it again.
Right.
That's how powerful lust is to you, Scott. I mean, to your characters, that you imbue with so much reality.
Well, Bill says that he became fascinated with this figure who's called Leighton Merriwell when he was in the waning days of his marriage. And the part that just sort of blew his mind was that he said he would give up everything he had attained in order to get this young woman to return to him. And that concept is fascinating to Ten Boom.
And every time the General, Merriwell, and Boom, the protagonist, get together, they talk about this sort of common ground. And at some point, I think Merriwell says that instead of being regretful, if you look back in your waning days and still remember this in your heart, it was worth it, despite all the loss.
Right.
Wow. Yes. And there's an old Mexican proverb, unless it's a Yiddish proverb, because all proverbs are the same in every culture, including Roma. The most bitter regret is for the sins we did not commit. And John D. MacDonald used that in one of the Travis McGee books as an epigraph. Is that what they're saying? What are you saying through them?
It's you go on book tour, people ask the same questions again and again. So everybody shied away from the sex in the book.
Well,
except Paul. So
you don't want to go there, do you, pal?
No, I actually.
Well, let me feed you some lobs.
I commend Ten Boom for his late life sexual awakening, and that's what it's meant to be. And it's a very odd environment in which he first discovers this, because he is in Bosnia, where the most recent and in some ways most horrible war crimes of the 20th century were committed. And he has some awareness that it's just knowing about the way all forms of restraint were abandoned, that it's had some influence on him, that who cares about petty rules of professional behavior where you're in a place where children were broiled alive, and that it becomes a starting point for some of his reinvention of himself.
And part of his journey is a journey of self-discovery, not just what happened to the 400 Roma people.
Correct.
And related to that, in a place where all of this horrible stuff happened, is kind of a secondary notion that I think is part of your theme, but you'll tell us, that none of us know what we would do in a situation of war, where whether we would be courageous or cowardly. I can't say too much because it would give away one of the big twists late in the book, but you've spent some time thinking about that.
Well, I think anybody who's practiced as a criminal defense lawyer thinks about that one. And Bill's landlady, he ends up sharing the apartment of a woman whose husband is overseas working for his NGO.
Aha! Remember that the husband is not there.
And she is a defense lawyer at the other big criminal tribunal in town that's finishing its business trying people who committed war crimes in Yugoslavia. And he eventually says to her, he says, this is a very weird thing for me to say because, I was a white-collar criminal defense lawyer and I represented some of the biggest cruds in the world. But when you talk about some of the people that you represent, how can you represent people like that? He says, I don't mean to sound like some yahoo at a cocktail party, but how can you do that? And she responds to him, because I don't know what I would do in wartime. Now this, oddly, is a remark that was made to me by a young defense lawyer at the ICC. And she was representing somebody who was accused of and undoubtedly was guilty of using rape as an instrument of war. And I said, Marie, I don't want to be politically correct, but I would think that this particular defendant would be, and his crimes would be particularly hard for a young woman to represent. And she gave me that answer. She said, I know, and it's kind of a there but for the grace of God, and it's an awareness of what happens in war to seemingly decent people.
But it's also a question, is it not, that has been asked of you. You represent people convicted of murder.
I have done that.
It's a question I'm sure asked of Roy Black, sitting in the first row here, who's represented any number of people accused of serious crimes. My wife, Marcia, sitting there. I've heard people ask that. How do you represent those people? How do you answer that question?
I really do believe that everybody is entitled to a defense. And as Boom says, that doesn't mean a defense by me. So, and it comes down to a personal value system. My partners couldn't stand the idea that I would represent major drug dealers, except for the baggage that goes along with it. I had no problem doing that. Mm-hmm. I always refused to represent members of organized crime. The idea that a lot of killing was done just for business really bothered me, and it wasn't like there weren't plenty of lawyers in Chicago happy to do that. So, I wasn't denying them a defense. It just wasn't something that I was willing to do. The legendary bad guy of the Bosnian War is Radovan Karadzic, and there is a character in testimony who I call Laza Kajovic, and I was amused shortly after testimony came out when I got a letter from Mr. Karadzic's defense lawyer.
And he's in prison.
He was convicted in the last year and sentenced to 40 years in prison. One of the few people who actually got consecutive sentences in these kinds of tribunals, and he earned them the old-fashioned way. But he liked the book a lot. And,
Well, the character was somewhat dashing
yeah,
in his
yeah. He told me he wasn't sure that Karadzic was going to enjoy the book as much as he had, but that he thought he would be impressed with the writing. So,
Now, as a personal matter or philosophy, you are opposed to the death penalty.
I always say don't criticize anybody's point of view about the death penalty because I have held every point of view.
Okay.
But in the early part of this century, I sat on the commission in Illinois that studied capital punishment. And I just concluded this doesn't work. It doesn't give citizens what they think they're getting out of it. And it's kind of a lawyer's argument against it, but I am a lawyer. And I don't think capital punishment delivers the moral message that people want to deliver by executing other people.
And I assume, to be consistent, you would apply that to crimes against humanity, war crimes, the Serbian fellow who is in prison, or would you?
Ultimately, my answer is yes. And again, it's a lawyer's answer because what the history of the death penalty has proven is that it escapes all categorical restraint. So the argument, for example, to execute terrorists, assuming you catch them alive, makes a lot of sense. The problem is that you never, if you have the death penalty, even for that limited purpose, somebody will come along and say, some brilliant legislator who's interested in currying public favor will come along and say, well, this crime, whatever it is almost as bad as terrorism. And pretty soon you're back in the same muddle that we're in right now in those states like this one that still practice capital punishment. In the civilized state that I come from, Illinois, we no longer practice capital punishment.
Well, there was a scandal, more or less, was there not, in the courts in Illinois?
I mean, if you consider sentencing 17 people to death who were later proven not to have committed the crimes for which they were sentenced to death, yes, that's kind of a scandal.
Technicalities,
Yeah.
always with the technicalities. In about the middle of the book, Testimony, there is a gigantic action sequence that involves our hero being put in jeopardy,
Right.
and ending up on a silo filled with, I want to say hydrochloric acid, but it's a salt-making
right.
thing. You don't want to be put into this silo.
You don't want to fall
No,
in the
it'd be
silo.
worse than the
Right.
silo of corn in Witness.
Right.
But most of your writing is not long action sequences. Was this fun? Was it
Yeah, it was
highly
great.
cinematic?
I wrote that scene in a single day.
No.
And I mean, I rewrote it a lot,
Right.
but once I got there, I knew exactly what was going to happen, and yeah,
It was scary. Now,
it's meant to be.
yes, but because the book is written in first person
It is.
also.
It is.
So it's Boom talking. I figured, because I was halfway through the book, he was going to be alive, otherwise there wouldn't be the rest of the
Right.
book.
That's
See, astute reader.
That's that old fictional convention that if the book is written in the past tense and the first person, the narrator has to survive to tell you the story.
Even though he could be on death row, as in The Postman Always Rings Twice, I think.
Right.
Anyway.
Somebody wrote a novel where it was told wasn't that Alice Sebold's book, Yeah.
Oh, the girl who
Yeah.
died and
Yeah,
is
she's-
telling it from
Right.
the
Right.
beyond.
Telling it from heaven. Yeah.
That was a tricky thing to do.
It was. But
Yes.
It's a brilliant book.
So all of these characters, major characters in the book, seem to have secrets and hidden agendas and may not be what they seem, several of the
Right.
main characters.
Right.
Is there some thematic material there that you're telling us about the world? What's your overall view as expressed by these characters?
I think knowing other people, really knowing other people, is hard. And I was thinking about a friend who's been in a long relationship, and the relationship has ended. And I like the woman that he was living with a great deal, but I also said to myself, you have no clue. You don't know what was going on within the walls of that house.
You don't know what's going on in their house.
I have no idea. I have no idea.
Is part of this also, since Boom doesn't, at the beginning of the novel, know who he is, that it's so hard for him to determine, is Esma for real?
Right.
And being so distracted by those ample bosoms, that, which may cloud a man's
We can
judgment.
tell that certainly Paul was distracted by the end.
Was just another guy. What can I say? But I'm being serious here, Scott.
I know.
I think, I should ask this as a question. I'm supposed to be interviewing. Would it be so easy to pull the wool over a man's eyes,
As happens to Boom. Yeah.
Yes, as happens. So I don't want to say too much, but if he wasn't so consumed by lust, and then the lust turning into the best sex he's ever had, is that something that?
I don't. One of the characters says something that, of course, this parade of men who've given up, power and success in order to get laid, that sex is very powerful, and that's a truth.
Okay.
I'm here to tell you something about that, and
it's a veil. It's a veil that they cannot see through.
Right, but
these foolish men, not like you and me, but these foolish men that you write about. Yes.
Yeah, it's a powerful force, and obviously a highly symbolic force. And your point before that, because Ten Boom is not fully at home with himself, he may be particularly vulnerable to that. And then there's that theme that goes on in my novels of men discovering themselves through women. And that obviously is also taking place in this book, and has taken place in other novels that I've written, starting with Presumed Innocent. So I know it's going on, but I just keep writing about it again and again.
Well, because you do it well, and there's a truth, more than nuggets of truth. That's the world that we live in, we foolish men. Presumed Innocent, which you just raised, was a murder trial. There's one dead woman. There's one lawyer accused going to trial as the woman was his former lover. It's this beautiful, tight, compact story, and now testimony is this big, broad canvas. Did you always know you were going to be painting on a larger canvas?
You don't really ever see a book until you're done with it. And I really wanted to write about the International Criminal Court, largely because I'd never seen any novel set there. And, I thought that's a very large theme for somebody who's written about the law. And I was confident that I could learn about the court. I always have wanted to know about the Roma, so I was confident that I could learn about them. When I realized that I was going to have to write about Bosnia, I figured, well, I can learn about this too. And it's only really since the book came out about 3 weeks ago that I've turned around and said to myself, this was a bigger challenge than you ever acknowledged. Wow. And I probably would have been, had I been frank with myself, I probably would have been too scared to write the book. But, to me, there was definitely a feeling that it's time to write this book. And as I said, I was confident I could handle it. My beloved agent, Gail Hockman, once I handed in the first draft, she was just wildly excited. And this is great, this is amazing, I love this book. And then she said, and by the way, when you described this book, I thought you were out of your mind.
Thanks for telling me now.
She was,
yes.
She was completely relieved when she, that the thing was legible. So.
Do you ever picture actors in films playing the roles?
I've largely gotten over that because what happens in this town is so wildly unpredictable,
right.
That and I've always really prided myself on being a novelist first. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to write a really good novel. And the other thing is when you're writing a novel which is set like 60-70% in Europe, you can pretty much forget about the movies anyway, because Americans are famously xenophobic, and they want to see movies about Americans.
Well, let's just play the game anyway. You're the casting director. You've got Ten Boom and you've got Esma. Do you have any thoughts? If you could just cast it tonight.
There are a lot of older guys who could play Ten Boom. The movie stars whose careers last far longer than the women. George Clooney would be great, but
terrific.
Esma's in some ways harder.
Oh, much harder.
I of course I say Selma Hayek, but as my
yes.
wife will tell you, that's my answer to everything.
Well, as long as she's okay with that. I'm going to cast it. May I cast it?
Sure.
Okay. Daniel Craig, Rachel Weisz.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Perfect.
Is there a producer out here or anyone with $100 million tonight? Before you wrote Presumed Innocent, there was a book called 1L.
Yeah.
And am I correct that first-year law students are still reading it?
Yeah.
What year was it
Based
published?
on the royalty reports, it appears
yes, well, that's good.
It appears to be the case.
That's good. What year was that published?
1977.
77
That's 40 years ago.
40 years ago. So either it's a really good book or legal education has not changed in 40 years, or both.
Both may be the answer,
Yeah.
and maybe that, law school has changed somewhat. And generally speaking, the legal classroom is not as cruel a cauldron that it once was. But somehow the experience of being a law student presents for many people some kind of crisis of identity. And
This is a theme with you.
Yes. For me, big time.
Okay.
Big time.
And tell us more about 1L, if you would.
Well, 1L is, there are many amusing 1L stories, but I wrote 1L on a fluke. I had been a writing fellow at Stanford, and then I'd been teaching down there, and rather than go on with academic life, I decided that I would go to law school because I was fascinated with the law. So I had a literary agent, and I was embarrassed to tell her that, after I had written a novel. She'd sent it to 23 different publishers. They'd all rejected it. May have something to do with the fact that the plot hinged on something only I found fascinating, that is the implied warranty of habitability. But it was a rent strike book. But she schlepped this manuscript all over New York, and now I was going to tell her that I was going to law school. And so largely as a sop, I'm literally writing her this letter, and I get to the second page, and I'm like, just sounds lame. I'm going to go on writing, and I'm going to carry the torch. And so I said, and by the way, I haven't read a nonfiction book that is just kind of a day-by-day account of what it's like to be a law student. And I explained this in several sentences. At no point in that letter did I actually say that I was willing to write that book or even wanted to. And I thought I was just sort of rewarding her with what I thought was a fertile idea. So she went out to lunch with an editor, now of blessed memory, a man named Ned Chase, who was Chevy Chase's father. And apparently they both got drunk. And about 5 o'clock, Elizabeth remembered she had my letter in her purse, and Ned thought, oh, this is a brilliant idea, and wrote a contract on the spot. So, and it was just typical of my difficulties in communicating with this woman that she didn't even bother calling me. So I'm at home in San Francisco, and I go to the mail. It's a very odd envelope from Elizabeth, because all the envelopes she sent were very flat. It was, here's another one, and there was another publisher's polite rejection letter for my novel. This one is thick. It's got something in it, and it turns out to be this contract to write this book about law school, a book that I had not actually proposed writing. And I had, of course, a sabering sense of the ironies of this, and realized then, something that has grown truer every year, the great break of my literary career was going to law school. And I wrote the book during my first year of law school. Ned's other son is a lawyer, and he knew that the first year was the dynamic year. Of course, I sent him the manuscript. Finished it in 14 weeks after my first year in law school. I sent him the manuscript. At that point, I paid the price for the drunken luncheon. He calls me up and he says, I have just one question about this book. And I say, well, you don't like the way it's written, you don't like the way it's typed. No, that's all fine. We can read the damn thing. He says, just need you to remind me. He says, why did I ever want to buy this book?
And 40 years later,
yeah.
What is it? I read the book. What is it about that book that law students feel that they are compelled to read it? They want to know what your experiences were like in the 1970s.
Well, I mean, there's certain reassurances that law students get from 1L. One is that no matter how crazy they think they are, there is someone who went through that who was even crazier. So, 1L is in some ways just a diary of unabashed neurosis on the rampage. Beyond that, I do think that the book is really honest about the transformation that law students feel often they are being forced to undertake in order to become a lawyer and to participate in a mode of thought which, while enormously useful and which is broadly shared in the legal profession, we all know that there is something about the law's model of human behavior that is not completely adequate. And people feel, sort of forced into that mold. And that's true no matter how nice your professor is. And I think that's what continues to give the book vitality. But I've just written a new introduction for the 40th anniversary edition, and I'm going back to Harvard Law School to talk about it on the 40th anniversary, and it's weird, because I read the book and it's all still live to me.
And to many others. Are you still practicing law?
I practice a little bit. I went part-time I think it was 1989, I announced to my partners. I just about finished The Burden of Proof, and I said, I can't go on like this. So we agreed that I was going to reduce my law practice. And originally, as I said to somebody earlier tonight, that meant cutting back from 2,200 hours to 1,800 hours.
Lawyers here know what that means.
Yeah.
Yes.
But, it's dwindled over the years. A couple of years ago, I finished my term as president of the Authors Guild, and I said, well, I owe it to my partners, because I'd done barely anything during those years. And I took a couple of cases. They were, by every definition, good cases. They're both criminal matters. And I got in the middle of the cases, and, it was the same thing I'd done dozens of times before. The clients were lying, of course, and for very different reasons. In one case, it was a family business. In the other case, it was corporate executives of a publicly traded company. But I was like, it's always the same thing. And I said, I am not going to take another ride on the same merry-go-round. So, what I do next, and I'll probably get into a big pro bono case this fall, is going to be about issues that I haven't dealt with before.
There are some people here tonight, some are lawyers, who would like to write a novel.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, suggestions, warnings, caveats?
Well, as I said before, I had come to college, I wanted to be a novelist, I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. Then I spent 5 years at Stanford, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And then I'm standing in the Harkness Commons at Harvard Law School when the 1L comes out, and there was a great review by Christopher Lamenhaupt in the Daily New York Times. And I'm standing there behind classmates who are reading this review, and more than one of them said, oh, I should have done that. and I'm like,
thinking they could.
Yeah. So the first thing I have to say is you got to write. Writers write, and it does take some practice. And if the first book doesn't go well, don't be discouraged. Right. And I have a friend in Chicago who showed up at a signing I did, and he published a first book, and he got a huge advance for it, and the book was not as successful as the publishers thought it would be, and he's refused to write another book because he found it so painful to read his bad reviews and see his publisher's disappointment. And it's understandable, but you can't, and I know you know the same thing as a writer. If you have to be able to take a punch in this business.
Oh yeah.
And you've got to be able to get up off the canvas, and let them knock you down again. You got to be rocky, and that's my advice is write, and don't give up.
Good words. I have this idea for a book, Scott. I want to run it by you.
I have to say, by the way, I got to tell you a quick story about a Miami lawyer. I was in my law office, and the phone rings, and it's a guy who identifies himself as a lawyer in Miami.
Yeah.
And he says, I've got this great idea for a novel.
Don't they all?
And I said, no, I don't listen to other people's ideas. And he says, no, and he says, that's not why I'm calling. And I said, and I told him, you got to write the book. He says, no. He says, what I want to know is, when I write this book, how do I sell the movie rights? So,
just getting a little ahead of himself.
Anyway.
Yes. I've got this idea, and I was going to call you and get your advice. I've got a title. It's I'm going to call it 2L, and it's about second year in law school. We'll talk about that. Let's close with this and then throw it open for some questions. What are you working on? What's next?
I've started a novel that I hope will be of much smaller scope. Someday I'll write a short book. I've actually done it once, but by accident. But I have, it's about an elderly lawyer who is, this is going to be his last major case, clearly.
Okay.
And he's representing a former Nobel Prize winner who's, of course, accused of doing something wrong. And it's in very early stages.
Okay.
So.
I had the same damn idea. That we will wait for that. Is it? Where's Ted? Is it time that we take some questions? I have thoroughly enjoyed talking with you, and I think that these folks have enjoyed listening.
Yes, Paul, it is
Oh, there
that
he
time
is.
for
There he
questions
is.
from the audience. Just a quick reminder around here, questions typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are short. Only Paul gets to ask follow-up questions, and there is nothing like a two-part question.
Are you trying to encourage questions or discourage questions?
What is it? And there's a $10 fee for questions.
It's like, and then I'm going to beat you if you.
That Ted, he is something.
Hi, Scott. I'm actually a big fan of your books. And
Thank you.
one thing I wondered, when you go through the detail of writing a book, I imagine one of those animations where as you go forward, it sort of shows up on the page. And my question is about the stuff that sort of is off to the side that fades into the distance. And do you have to make up a lot of other stuff in your head in order to create the story? You may not use it, or is it really just easy to follow that one straight path and sort of not have to fill in blanks that you may or may not use?
I got distracted as you were asking the question. So, Ted, do you want to reframe it?
Okay. Well, when you're writing the story, there's the stuff you need for the story, but how much are you affected by backstories and things that you have to make up? I mean, you make up that stuff and you don't use some of it, or is it just, don't worry about it, I'm going to keep going?
I understand. What suddenly came into my head as you were asking the question was, I'm very friendly with John Grisham, who I like a lot, but we were having breakfast a few years ago, and John looked at me and says, you know what, I just stopped writing the parts of a book that I don't think people are going to read. He says, I don't bother with that anymore. And I do bother with that. And a lot of my process in writing is, in the first year that I'm working on a book, I'll sit down and I'm really interested in what's the history of this character. Personal history, professional history. And there'll be days when that's what I'll write, even though I know from past experience that very little of that is going to survive into the final draft of the novel. But to me, that's where the novel is, in having a sense of the fullness of this imagined world that is being created day by day. So that part is really very important to me, and it's really, at the end, I want it all to come together. I want the story to elucidate the character, and I want the world that I'm creating to be coherent. But it's really that part, as it gets a kind of imaginary fullness, to me, that's the most important thing.
Thank you. This has been great. I just wanted to ask you if you could talk about your process in general from start to finish and how it's changed over the years.
Over the years, I've talked to lots of novelists, and, you know, we all end up in the same place, which is to say a book between covers. But everybody gets there in his or her own way. And, you know, Paul and I have a friend, Ridley Pearson, who, you know, outlines relentlessly and can't begin until he's got, you know, a wall full of note cards, and knows exactly what's going to happen. And Sue Grafton has told me that she can't go on to chapter 2 until she has got chapter 1 perfect. And that's you know, and then she can't do 3 until 2 is perfect. I am sitting here largely because the personal computer was invented. And I wrote Presumed Innocent while I was working as an assistant U.S. attorney. Very demanding job. The only time I had to write was on the morning commuter train. And so I had 30 minutes a day to write. And I didn't have the time, with only 30 minutes, to sort of fool around and worry about sequence. I just wanted to write something that I thought was good that day. And so I would write, you know, descriptions of a character or of a building, a snatch of dialogue that I thought was interesting. I'd, you know, transmogrify something that I'd seen in court the day before. I just wanted to write, and as I talked about it to myself, I said, I want to write from inspiration. And you know, that's what I did. I did it for years, and then, of course, I had to put it all together. That's still sort of what my process is. In the first year that I'm working on a book, like the book that I'm just described to Paul, I'll write anything, anywhere in that book. You know, if I get ideas for scenes, sort of apropos the first question, this is an old man now. He's been practicing for many years with his daughter. And the daughter walks in, she's about 60, and tells him that she is retiring. And, you know, and I got the idea for that scene. I had no idea the daughter was going to retire. But, you know, I wanted to write that scene. I thought that was funny and revealing of my main character. And, you know, I allowed myself to write that scene. And I'll go on doing that for the next year, and then I'll stand back and say, well, you better start lining this stuff up. If it were not for the personal computer, there would be no way to do that. You know, Nabokov supposedly wrote his books the same way, on index cards, and which he could then put in order. But, you know, I'm no Nabokov.
Well, he also wrote in his third language. He spoke Russian at home, he learned French, then he wrote in English.
Right.
I could not write in Russian.
Yeah,
No.
right. I can't speak 3 languages.
Right.
Matter of fact, I can't speak 2. So,
Where are they out there? Ted?
Good evening. Thank you so much for speaking about 1L. And it's interesting, you kept talking about law students. I read it while I was still a college student at UCLA trying to pick a law school. And one of the several things that informed my decision ultimately to go to Harvard was reading 1L, because of all of this mystique that people talked about that a California girl like me with no lawyers in the family couldn't figure out. Your book made sense to us, and it really had an impact. That's why I didn't even have time to come to this tonight, but I so wanted to finally meet the author of 1L because it really did have a profound impact. I couldn't even get a copy of it at the UCLA bookstore. I had to go to the law school bookstore and make a lot of fuss. This is in 1988 to try to get a copy, and I couldn't even find it. So I just wanted to say that for me and for hundreds of my fellow alums, it really made a profound difference. I would like to know, when our alumni talk to you about it, is it wouldn't have gone if I hadn't read it, or I was prepared because I read it? I'm just wondering where people come out on that, because I know you're hearing this from our fellow grads.
Well, I sometimes say that 1L was written in order to reduce competition in the legal profession. And for people who, so I hear from a lot of people who say, I read 1L and it scared me to death and I didn't want to go to law school after that, and I'm really glad I didn't. And then there are also many people like you who say, I read 1L and it seemed, you made Harvard Law School seem, like an exciting challenge, and I wanted to do it. And to people like you, I say, so it's not my fault. You were warned, it really was a book that was written in what was actually a pretty difficult time in my life, because I'd been a teacher at Stanford, and all of a sudden I'm in the cheap seats, and I'm not feeling like I'm getting it. So it was all really hard for me. And the passion of 1L, which I think is what some people, it sounds like that's what you latched onto. It was genuine. And I still don't regret going to law school. It's been, as I said, the great break of my literary career. I thought it was an amazing education. I like what lawyers do. I even like lawyers, unlike most people in the United States. And I'm glad that it, informed your life, and sounds like you were happy that you made the decision that you did.
Scott, you write a lot in various publications. You do a lot of opinion pieces. Could you talk about the role of a novelist or an artist in that commentary space? And
well, it's an odd story to tell in LA, but not long after Presumed Innocent came out, I was asked by the New York Times op-ed page if I had anything I wanted to say about the O.J. Simpson case. It was drawing to a close. And I said, yeah, I want to write an op-ed, this was before the verdict, explaining why he was acquitted. And of course, at that time, many people who'd been following the trial were certain that he was going to be convicted. So I wrote this op-ed in a day of slower communication before the verdict, explaining why he was acquitted. And that was a good start as an op-ed writer. For many years, I was welcome to write anything I wanted to for the Times. And I am much more opinionated in my op-ed writing than I am in my novels. I don't think political messaging is part of a novelist's job. I'm there to, as Aristotle would put it, enlighten and entertain. So I'm not super political in the novels, but when I get the pen in my hand to write an essay, I'm pretty frank. And just as one example, I don't think testimony takes a really. It's clear that Ten Boom doesn't agree with General Merriwell about the International Criminal Court, but it doesn't go on at great lengths about it. But I think the United States has made a grave mistake not supporting the court. I think it's weakened the court tremendously, and it's left us in a position where, with Bashar al-Assad, we're busy bombing. We bomb an airfield instead of saying to Assad what we should, which is, you were going to have your day, and you will stand trial and be punished for what you have done. We can't do that because when we pulled out of the International Criminal Court, so did Syria. So there's no ICC membership. There's no forum now where Assad can be tried and punished.
So we're together with Syria on that and climate change.
Yes.
We're right there with Syria.
That's right. How America is becoming more like Syria,
Yeah.
right? So, but the novels, I mean, it gives me a chance to say the things that that I don't want to inflict on the readers of the novels, and I'm sure I've alienated some parts of my audience with some of my op-ed writing. I wrote a couple of op-eds for Vanity Fair before about Judge Gorsuch, and the people on the right were just inflamed by these op-eds, and I thought what happened to Merrick Garland was really wrong, and that and was amazing to me that people were so angry at me for saying that, and I was like, what are you talking about? There hasn't been a Supreme Court nominee in 150 years who didn't get a vote in the Senate, and people, we're so divided now. It's unbelievable.
I actually thought you did make two political statements in testimony. I thought you were against mass murder and in favor of gypsy sex. That's the way, very clear to me.
Yeah. And I've never tried either. So
I wasn't asking. I was still thinking about Selma Hayek, however.
We have one more question.
So Boone says, and when he says it in testimony, it sounded right to me, it's not the foot soldiers who are going to be brought before the ICC, it's the top brass.
right.
So the reasons given is we're not going to have our soldiers tried before the ICC. We'll try them if they're guilty of something like Abu Ghraib, but that's not really the reason. The reason is because we don't want to see President Bush charged with a crime, war crime, that kind of thing. It's our political leaders. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's really two different questions. If I can, I don't know if I'm permitted a follow-up answer, Ted, but I am going to divide it into two questions. There are those who have long suggested that the reason that the United States, which had signed the treaty creating the ICC, that we withdrew from that, was because of some of the things that were going on in the war on terror, and specifically the CIA offsites, and that there was a fear that our political leaders, supposedly Vice President Cheney in particular, were afraid of being charged with war crimes. I have found absolutely nothing to support that. I think it was just the feeling of our military that we're the most active military in the world, and we're a target. Those fears, while understandable, I think are completely incorrect when you understand how the ICC actually works. So, that's the sort of the second part of your question. As to the first, it is indeed the policy at the ICC, as it was at the tribunal on the former Yugoslavia, that they want to charge generals, not privates. And it makes sense to me. But of course, it makes the cases much harder to prove because there are many layers between the generals and the privates. And, but they don't want to be prosecuting soldiers who will say, with some justification, I was just following orders. So they want to prosecute the people who gave the orders, and that does make sense to me.
Well, that brings us to the end of a wonderful evening. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Scott.